Over the last few decades, the world of gaming has become a lot more, well, open. What I mean specifically is that open world games have become significantly more present. From action-adventure to first-person shooters to RPGs, games of every genre you can dream up are opening up their world to allow the player more freedom than ever before. But despite it feeling like it may be a newer phenomenon, the origins of open world gaming go back several decades. And that really begs the question, what is the first open world game? GameRanks aims to answer this question as well as provide you a history of the evolution of open world gaming. Now, if we're going to talk about the origins of open world gaming, we have to be clear on what we mean by open world gaming. If we don't, there's probably some games you could define as open world that we aren't really talking about, meaning some ASCII text-based games or even stuff that's in wireframe. We aren't really talking about games that came before open world, we're talking about open world specifically. And while some of the ideas for open world may have come from these games, they're just not what we're talking about. Basically, when we say open world game, we mean a fairly large game world that doesn't direct you to any specific area by means of restriction. You're not necessarily required to complete the story in order to traverse the world. In fact, there may not actually even be a story. And to add to that, the player actually has to exist within the world. Not controlling the world so much, but controlling themselves within it. We don't want to accidentally include civilization in open world because, well, frankly, that's not an open world game. So what was the first open world game? We're considering Ultima 1, The First Age of Darkness, to be the first title we'd list as an open world game. Now, while obviously limited by the technology of the time, Ultima 1 does offer a very large world for the player to traverse. There's nothing really separating one area from the next, no artificial gates, no obviously contrived reasons why you can't go to this area yet. But the first Ultima does something different from most open world games in that its systems are not entirely seamless. First, dungeons are explored in first person. Second, combat is top down, which makes sense again because it was 1981 when the game came out. Exciting combat in first person is not exactly a realistic expectation at this point, but Ultima laid the foundation for a lot of RPGs, and RPGs laid a lot of the foundation for what we know as open world games. Several years later, a game called Elite came out, which was the first procedurally generated, free-roaming space game. It was kind of a crazy game for the time because it was 1984 and it was 3D. And keep in mind, the mainstream wasn't playing 3D games until 1996, 1997. It also had a really innovative open-ended game model that basically allowed you to roam space as you please and engage in combat and trade. And in the non-3D side of things, The Legend of Zelda came out just a few years later. Obviously, simply being 3D doesn't make a game open world, and like Ultima, The Legend of Zelda didn't force you in any specific direction. It just gave you an overworld and said go. There was an order that you could complete the dungeons that basically made it a little easier to do, but really if you wanted to do the hard stuff first, which would be basically impossible for anybody who hadn't played the game before, you could. Legend of Zelda owes a lot to Ultima, but so many other RPGs owe a lot to Legend of Zelda. That same year, Metroid came out. Metroid did something weird in that it was a side-scrolling game that didn't really require you to go to the right. In fact, they built an entire 2D open-world game. It's pretty interesting to think about the fact that Metroid is probably the first game that brought the open-world concept to an action game. In 1987, Sid Meier's Pirates came out, and it was instrumental in putting Sid Meier on the map. Players sailed around the West Indies, carrying out various missions for old world empires that dominated the world from the 16th to 17th centuries. There really isn't anything specific that you have to do to become successful in the game, and that's a big reason why it's so innovative in an open sense. Now, the next big step was Ultima 6. Ultima 1 through 5 featured open worlds to explore, but kind of had a fragmented experience without a specific perspective. The different systems of the game were all divided into separate perspectives. However, Ultima 6 finally unified all of this, and it really feels more cohesive, but at the same time extremely open. A development studio that had primarily worked on sports games and licensed properties by the name of Bethesda put out a game in 1994 called The Elder Scrolls: The Arena. Now, Elder Scrolls Arena is not quite the same thing that you play today. It is first person, but in 1990, that meant something a little bit different. What's really cool is that the world was actually randomly generated and contained hundreds of cities and dungeons. The second Elder Scrolls game came out 2 years later, called The Elder Scrolls II: Daggerfall. Now, Arena used a pseudo 3D process to make it look 3D, whereas Daggerfall was actually 3D. And again, things were randomly generated, this time around there being thousands of different towns and dungeons to explore. Thousands! And there were actually hundreds of thousands of different non-player characters to interact with. Was it entirely handcrafted? No, but the scale itself was establishing something that almost all games following it would attempt to emulate. The next year, 1997, would bring us Fallout, an open-world RPG that was played from an isometric perspective. It was set in a post-apocalyptic environment. Its retro-futuristic stylings and strange story that the player could engage with in such a non-linear way for 1997 has done a lot in garnering it a reputation as one of the best RPGs ever made. The player's actions directly influence the state of the world, and all choices have some kind of consequence. The next few years have some very important titles in open world gaming come out. The first of which was Grand Theft Auto in 1997. Now obviously Grand Theft Auto is controversial and we don't need to talk about it, but the game had 3 cities and were split into 6 levels, but they allowed you to transverse between them freely. Everything was mission based, which if you think sounds familiar, well, it's because it does. Basically everything uses this model now. The second title I'm talking about is Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time in 1998, which is essentially the second game of its type that's entirely 3D, the first being Mario 64, both with actually fairly similar control schemes. Now, it's important to say that Mario 64 is definitely not an open world game. So much freedom of movement doesn't necessarily mean open world, but Ocarina of Time definitely was. You had the freedom to explore Hyrule in a way that, though you never really were that particularly restricted in any previous Zelda titles, you still never had before thanks to technological restrictions. If you compare NES Zelda and N64 Zelda, you can see why technical limitations have been a big hurdle for open world. Ocarina is a big game that finally broke a lot of those, and you can really see how far it's come since the NES by using Ocarina of Time as a standard for comparison. It was crafted with so much detail for the time that it really does stand in a class of its own. And the third game that I'm talking about that essentially laid the groundwork for all modern open world gaming is Shenmue, which came out in 1999. Shenmue not only established what urban exploration would be like in open world gaming, it also gave us some very noticeable advancements that we see today as if it's nothing, when in reality, Shenmue was the first. Day and night cycles, weather, and fully voiced NPCs throughout the entire game, all in one game, were completely revolutionary at this point in time. It was an underrated game that absolutely changed gaming for the better. A few other games came out during this time period, like Grand Theft Auto 2, Asheron's Call, which actually featured a world that was over 500 square miles that wasn't divided into zones or levels or any kind of instances, as well as Midtown Madness, which gave you the freedom to drive around in a fully formed city. The next really big step in open world gaming was, of course, Grand Theft Auto 3. I very specifically remember the first time I played Grand Theft Auto 3. This game blew me the hell away and provided the roadmap for almost every single modern open world game. Here's the world you get. It's populated by a lot of people, some of which are a little bit rudimentary, but really don't have anything to do with your activities, and some that have agendas that you can cater to and complete missions for, and generally use to build your own empire. Everything about this game set the standard for everything that came after it. It took so many of the concepts from the last 2 decades that we've discussed and married them into one cohesive, enjoyable experience. The next year, 2002, brought the Elder Scrolls III: Morrowind. Now for me, Morrowind is kind of the first actual entry into the Elder Scrolls series, despite being the third game. Morrowind has much more in common with Skyrim than it does with Arena. And while it had a compelling plot, you were able to free roam and basically do questing without ever interacting with it. Fable took a slightly different approach in 2004 by being a pretty linear game set in a pretty non-linear world. Elder Scrolls Oblivion was the next step in the evolution from Morrowind and focused a little bit more on storytelling, but still expanding the open world capabilities. Stalker: Shadow of Chernobyl in 2007 was notable for being the first true open world first-person shooter. There actually wasn't too many entries into that genre, and that makes Stalker Stalker a unique game even today. Next, 2008 brought us both Far Cry 2 and Fallout 3, which as you know are both hallmark additions to the open world genre. Far Cry 2 giving you the sandbox kind of do whatever you want type abilities, whereas Fallout 3, developed by Bethesda, further developed the ideas that they had in their Elder Scrolls games, albeit against a completely different backdrop. Also in 2008, Grand Theft Auto 4 came out. Grand Theft Auto 4 really tries to cinematize the open world game. In many ways, it succeeded a lot. The characters were very well defined, the story made a lot more sense, and most actions felt like they had more gravity. However, strangely enough, despite having a pretty big city to do whatever you wanted in, it felt fairly linear, even though by all means it technically wasn't. The same year Batman Arkham Asylum came out, as did Red Faction Guerrilla. Arkham Asylum's open world was a little bit limited, but showed us what could be done to construct a narrative within a world where the player wasn't really restricted. Red Faction Guerrilla has the distinction of probably being the most open world game that you could destroy everything in. The next year Just Cause 2 came out, and while Just Cause 2 had a story, no one in the right mind gave a damn. Just Cause just lets you do whatever the hell you want in a sandbox environment that basically allows you to construct your own ridiculous action sequences with a massive array of tools and vehicles. Red Dead Redemption in 2010 was unique in its systems and the way that it gave us a somewhat historical environment to, Grand Theft Auto in. And then in 2011, Minecraft came out. Now, Minecraft is such a mind-blowingly important addition to open world, probably more so than any of the other games I've mentioned in this short space. Minecraft was so open-ended in that everything in the game could be deconstructed and reconstructed, essentially allowing you to do and make whatever you could possibly want. People made mods for it that made it possible to do different things, and people built both works of art and really their own games within the framework of Minecraft. The next few years brought us Borderlands 2, DayZ, and the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Skyrim probably being the next milestone that we need to talk about here a little bit. Skyrim actually scaled back some in terms of square miles. However, the world was a lot more dense with creation. It felt a lot more lived in, people felt a lot more realistic, the architecture was much more beautiful than ever before, and there was probably more for you to ever do in the game than there was in any other game prior to it. So let's look back at 2015. Dying Light, Witcher 3, Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, and Fallout 4. Dying Light is a cool game because it kind of brought a lot of parkour elements from games like Mirror's Edge to the zombie genre, and gave us that open world environment to kind of see what we can get stuck into, as well as what we can get ourselves out of, for that matter. The Witcher 3 is by far the densest, most rich, most satisfying open world RPG I have played. It has an incredibly deep, character-driven story that I don't think I've ever played an open-world game with a comparable narrative. Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain has the distinction of being the very first open-world stealth game, or at least AAA. It's actually somewhat weird that somebody hasn't come up with that concept before, but leave it to Hideo Kojima to think of. If there ever was a person in the gaming world who should get the title of Mad Genius, it's Hideo Kojima. Fallout 4 built on everything Bethesda has ever done right, and fixed a whole lot of stuff that was done wrong. Previous Fallouts had bad combat. Fallout 4 really did a good job mopping up that mess. It was just really exciting to see where Fallout had developed into, and while some people definitely weren't super duper enthusiastic about, but if you think about it, this was probably the biggest open world game. After Fallout 4, the concept of open world will continue to evolve, and though I can't imagine a world where artistic narrative is entirely gone, and player narrative is really all we experience, it's going to be very exciting to see exactly how much of Column A and Column B make it into the future of open world gaming. We'd love to hear your opinion on all this and have a nice big discussion in the comments about it, but also don't forget to click the like button, it does help us a lot, and if you're not subscribed to GameRanks, now's a great time to do so. As always, we thank you so much for watching this one, and we will see you again right here next time on GameRanks.